Welcome, everyone. I'm here again with one of your favorite guests, Preston Dennett. Preston, welcome.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me on.
Always a pleasure, and thanks for coming back on. So today we are going to cover the various species that have been reported by contactees. And if you find this information valuable or this episode valuable, please hit like and subscribe. And then if you've had any experiences, please feel free to enter it in the comments section. Preston, so you've covered this for what 30 years, 20 years? Probably more like 30 years.
35, actually.
Yeah, so over 30, well over 30 years, kind of pushing on 40. In the accounts that you've seen, do you have a sense for what kind of the characteristics are of the beings that are most often seen by contactees? And then what are the what's the variability? And if we go through each of the different potential species that you've seen, because, for all I know, they could also just be different manifestations of the same entity. Who knows? Right. I don't want to make any presumptions, but from your perspective, what have you seen?
Yeah. Well, I've talked to a lot of people who claim to have seen what we would call entities, right? And this is sort of what kept me out of the UFO field, honestly, because I'd heard reports of people who have claimed to have seen aliens. And the reports were all humanoids, human-looking figures. I thought, well, that's very Star Trek-y to me. I don't really believe this. And after I found out that my brother had seen a UFO, my sister-in-law saw grays. My other sister-in-law saw short blue beings, and had a number of friends who had encounters, people at work. This is how I got involved. And I looked into it, and I'm okay, this is a real phenomenon. People are seeing these things, and they are reporting these entities. And I absolutely am convinced that they're not lying, that they are accurately perceiving and reporting these things.
And you know that because there's certain things that are non-public that they mention that are consistent. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And the first time that really hit me hard was when I was interviewing my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, who hadn't read any books on UFOs, and this was at a time when it really wasn't saturating the media like it is today. She had never heard of grays. Grays were not something that was talked about back at that time. And she didn't even really interpret it that way. All she says, these were not human. I don't know what they were, but they were not human. And I said, well, describe them to me. And I had picked up a few. There was maybe a handful of books at that time describing what we now know of as grays. And she described 5-foot-tall figures wearing olive green jumpsuits with very large, oversized heads, extremely pale skin, huge dark eyes, almost no lips, just a slit for a mouth, very, very small nose, no visible ears. Basically what we know of as grays. And as I began to collect accounts, that's the one that turned up the most. I remember the second one I got vividly was I was talking to a lady at work who I'd worked with for years. And her whole family were seeing UFOs. I'm like, let me talk to them. And I talked to her daughter, and her daughter's like, well, these things came into my room. I'm like, what do you mean? She says, these figures. I'm like, describe them to me. She says, honestly, Preston, I did not get too good of a look at them because they scared the daylights out of me. I'm like, well, just tell me what you saw. She said, well, they were short, very skinny, large, oversized heads, huge dark eyes. I didn't see much more than that. And they said, don't be afraid. We won't hurt you. And next thing she remembers is being inside of a rounded room, and described what I've heard of, many times of, people being physically examined by what we would call grays. So I started to really interview people, and this is what I heard most was grays. And they generally are described very much the same way, as being anywhere from 3 to 4 feet tall, upwards to 5 or 6 feet, but generally 4 feet tall, about. and often wearing tan jumpsuits, perhaps, sometimes silvery, but more often people will say, I'm not even sure they were wearing anything. They don't describe seeing, actual anatomy. So I'm suspecting that this is a skin-tight suit.
Mm-hmm.
But always the dark eyes, always the slit for a mouth, always the pale, pale skin, sometimes perhaps slightly bluish or tannish or white or gray, but along those lines. And just this, it's a very specific description. And the more accounts I collected, I would say at least 50 to 70% were what we would call grays. And there's variation. Some will describe smaller, rounder eyes. Some will describe huge, huge wraparound eyes. Some said their eyes were not black necessarily, but particularly on board a craft, there's some indication that these dark eyes could be lenses that they remove. Because many people who are on board the craft say that no, they have bluish eyes, or green eyes even, or light-colored eyes. But the grays is, yes, by far the most common in my files. And I would certainly say that's probably true with most researchers.
Mm-hmm.
There's some disagreement about that. There was a recent study by the Free organization headed by Ray Hernandez, and they did a survey with some thousands of people, and light beings came up, I think, as the number one category. Kind of surprised me because I've only got a few accounts of what I would call glowing, bright white figures. But I do have a few, and those are also reported in humanoid in shape. But people don't get a whole lot of detail because all they're seeing is something you might even interpret as angelic, just a glowing white figure.
In what context do they see these things? Like in their room, outside? Are there any cases when it might just be a different phase of reality? In other words, if they confuse beings that they might see in the astral plane for these beings? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. I don't.
No, almost exclusively in the bedroom. Really, I mean, I don't want to say exclusively because on craft and sometimes outside, but no, usually. And this is something that actually really surprised me because I was thinking about this not too long ago. I'm like, where's the most likely place to see an ET? Your bedroom, to be perfectly honest. People are going out there, trying to call down UFOs and have contact, when really the most effective place might be to just lay down in your bed and call them in. Because the fact is, this is where most people are seeing what we would think of as extraterrestrials. And they're mostly grays. And when someone's taken on board a craft, that's usually what they will describe. That is the most common type in my experience. And
now with grays, again, in the literature, or maybe even just in the popular conception, are grays actual biological entities or artificial biological entities? I think there's the example I can think of is the Whitley Strieber example of the gray bodies kind of piled like cordwood. So like they're like vehicles to be occupied. What's your view of that, or what does the literature say on that?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Yeah, I think there are different types. There is an AI, artificial intelligence, biological android type being. And these can be differentiated from the others in that they are usually much shorter, 3 feet tall, and emotionless for the most part. And these are the people, as near as I can tell, who scoop people out of their beds often. And then they're taken on board a craft, and they meet a 5 foot tall gray who does have emotions and is a biological being with, odors, body odor, so to speak. Whitley Strieber talked about that. I did a whole research.
The cheese.
Which turns up. People describe it as woodsy or sort of a
cinnamon. Cinnamon's the other one.
Cinnamon odor. Dolly talks about this. I asked her specifically because she's very much awakened to her contact. She doesn't have missing time. She doesn't have fear. I've got a full-length book about just her experiences alone. she's an extraordinary person in terms of having contact.
Can you just, for the audience, can you just mention the book and where they can find it really quickly?
Yeah, it's called Symmetry, A True UFO Adventure. She's had contact since she was a little girl, really woke up to it at age 14. And since then it's the most extensive case I've really had the privilege to investigate. And for that matter, even read about, honestly. There are people who have extensive contact, but a lot of them have recalled this through hypnosis. And she's got multiple eyewitnesses. She's got medical evidence. She's got a lot of photographic evidence. So her case.
Well, she also proved it in real time to you too, right? Because I know sometimes I've gotten pushback where people hear her story and don't believe it. But I know that in your experience, you've been with her physically, and like you've had sightings when she was around. Is that's accurate, right?
Right. So I've been able to vet her story to my satisfaction. Proving it to someone else is another matter, especially if they're, a diehard skeptic. Really, the only way anyone's ever going to know is through personal experience. You can believe all you want, but you don't know anything until you've personally experienced it. So fine, be skeptical. She's not telling her story to convince skeptics anyway. It's more to help people who are experiencing this, or to contribute what she knows. But I asked her about Whitley Strieber's account where he saw them stacked up like cordwood. She said, yes, I have seen that. She says they are biological androids, and this is something I've had a number of people tell me. She was able to provide more detail than others. She's seen them turned off and on, seen them stored away in rooms, and this sort of thing. And those look like Greys, but they're short little guys, but otherwise identical to the descriptions that we hear. But the Greys have the same variation that we have here on Earth in terms of humanity, with very tall people, very skinny people, people with various head shapes and features and so forth, types of hair and skin color. So we see that same variation among Greys, with people describing, almost normal-sized heads, or even some with hair, wispy hair perhaps, but you get a huge variation that's very similar to what we see here on Earth. So
there's one interesting thing that I've had former military remote viewer Dr. David Morehouse on this show several times, and we did cover episodes on remote viewing, alien civilizations, etc. And what he told me, I don't know if it was offline or if it was on the show, but he says that he said, I don't believe in alien civilizations. I know they exist because I've seen them. But one thing he did mention offline, that it was more of a curiosity to him, kind of, or an observation, not a curiosity, but an observation. He said in all his time in remote viewing, the one species that he's never seen are Greys. He didn't have a reason for it. He wasn't saying that they don't exist, but it was just a curiosity. So I've never remote viewed them for whatever reason. I don't think he spoke for his colleagues. He was just talking about him personally. Any theories on why that might be? And again, I'm not coming at it from not believing, because if people say that they've seen these things over and over again, I think there's a good reason to believe what they're seeing.
Yeah, but I couldn't even venture a guess as to why he particularly hasn't, because most people who been pulled on board a craft or report seeing entities talk to me about some variation of what we would call Greys, for sure. But beyond that, there are many types, and some are clearly not Greys. I would say the second most common is just your plain old human-looking figure.
And are we talking Nordics, or are we talking just something separate from what are traditionally termed the Nordics?
They're termed Nordics. I don't like the term because it's not accurate. And people say, well, Pleiadian. And I'm like, well, I'm not sure that's really accurate either. So I personally just call them human looking because they are essentially human in their appearance. But again, here's the same variations that we have on our own planet. I talked to a Native American, Stan Hughes, who had an object land right in front of him. He's had a number of encounters, but he had object land in front of him while driving along the base of Thunder Mountain in Idaho, I think near the Panhandle. And his car stopped. This thing comes down. It's a huge silver sphere, and out steps a so-called Nordic. The reason I don't like the Nordic term because this guy was not Nordic in appearance. He was human-looking, but Dan Hughes described him as having dark skin. And I'm like, well, how dark? He looked Iranian to me, Middle Eastern. And he had long, shoulder-length dark hair, very dark eyes. Like, Preston, this was an extremely handsome man. I'm married. He's like, but this man was very good looking. Kind of went on about that. So that was kind of, funny. And he described it as wearing blue boots, I think, or silver boots and a blue jumpsuit. I'd have to look that up to be certain. But I was pretty certain that's what he described. Very muscular, which is very much in line with what people report. There's another gentleman I interviewed, Michael Carter, who I'm sure isn't, pulling my leg. He's a reverend. He is a really good man. He was a social worker who was commended by President Clinton for his work against racism. He's African American in descent, ancestry. At any rate, he had an experience. He's seen grays. He's been taken on board. He's had missing time. But he had an experience where he woke up and there was these Nordic guys, I guess you'd call them. And in his case, they were Nordic, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, a male and a female, 6.5 feet tall. And as many people describe, almost genetically perfect looking, very beautiful, very strong, wearing jumpsuits. And they sent a beam of light to him and healed him of a blood clot in his leg, which he was being treated for. That morning he woke up, his leg was no longer swollen. He went to the doctor. It was a big deal. The doctor freaked out. It's a good case. But, pertinent here is he described these figures that we call Nordics. Another gentleman I interviewed who only allowed his first name to be used, Don, he had an experience at Leo Carrillo Beach in Malibu, where he saw what he described as Mesoamerican looking people, a group of them, 5 or 10, well, closer to 10, all very similar looking, so similar they could have been twins or brothers and sisters. That's another thing we see quite often when people see what we would call these Nordics. So they were 5 feet tall, had, sort of light brown skin, very short hair, and the men and the women all looked very similar and didn't speak. It was a long, involved encounter, but they were wearing blue jogging type suits, he said, is how they kind of looked to him. And he's also a lifelong contactee. These are some of the accounts that I personally, interviewed people. And so this is the second most common type that people describe in my files. I think that's borne out by people like Barbara Lamb or John Mack, or maybe not David Jacobs so much, who's really focused on grays, or Bud Hopkins. But people who have interviewed a wide variety of contactees, I think, will end up getting a huge variety of humanoids.
And what percentage is that roughly in your files?
I haven't done a strict statistical analysis, but I'd say it's a good 10%, and it's getting higher because I'm hearing more and more of these. There was somewhat of a suppression of these types of reports because of the contactee era of the 1950s. Received a lot of skepticism and was almost pushed underground. People thought it ended. No, it did not. People were still seeing friendly, human-looking ETs, but the reports of grays really came hard and fast in the late 1980s, and really earlier than that, but became very popular due to the phenomenal success of Willie Strieber's book Communion, Bud Hopkins' book Intruders, and Missing Time. So a lot of people started reporting these. But yeah, human looking is very common. Travis Walton is a good example. He saw Greys and what we would call Nordics and described them the same way. Very tall, very genetically perfect, in terms of being beautiful and strong, and very similar, almost twins. So that's the sort of details we get from those. But
in your files, do people ever provide any detail on where these two groups might be from?
To some extent, yep. Dolly has been told flat out that they are from the Orion constellation. She can point to the specific star, which I talk about it in the book. It's one of the stars below the actual Orion's belt. But Orion comes up quite a bit in a number of cases. The Betty and Barney Hill case, she asked them where you're from, and they kind of avoided the question. But Marjorie Fish drew a star map that Betty recalled under hypnosis and pinpointed Zeta Reticula. And that has come up in a number of cases as well. So that's certainly a possibility. I've had a number of contactees ask, they say that they've asked this question. And one lady was told, well, you wouldn't understand. And another was told, it's not important. And another was told, we come from a place you don't know about yet. So they can be somewhat coy in their answers. And for that matter, some have said what I think are misleading statements in terms of like, we come from Mars or Venus or what have you. So I think there's some reluctance on the part of the ETs to reveal their exact whereabouts, perhaps, or likely due to the fact that we are a fairly violent species who does have a hold of some of this technology and could present a danger to them. I don't know. I don't want to speculate too far down that avenue, because honestly, that's still an open question as to where these guys come from. But yeah, Orion, I would say, comes up most. There's a few, like Andromeda. I'm like, well, that's a galaxy. Can you narrow it down a bit? Which I don't think is super helpful. And there's all kinds of speculation, like, are these time travelers from our future? Is it us from the future? And I ended up scouring the literature to sort of back that theory up. And I just could not find any even anecdotal evidence, as I would call it, eyewitness reports, observational evidence to support that, or interdimensional beings, or beings that are masquerading as ETs and putting on different appearances and pretending. And
that's the Jacques Vallée thesis, basically, right?
Right, which I don't subscribe to. I think that's just, I don't know exactly what he's putting forth that theory for. I think he's trying to explain some of the bizarre elements and some of the symbolic elements in UFO reports, which is all well and good, but his theory is very anthropocentric. It's very vague. There's no mechanism behind it to describe where these things come from or how they do this. And interdimensional, what does that even mean? We're all interdimensional. I mean, there are other dimensions, and we as human beings reportedly do have a dream body, a soul. There's all the near-death experience reports, ghost reports about out-of-body experiences, which we've done shows on. So there's an interdimensional aspect to, I think, all entities and all beings and all life. I don't think it's helpful to call these guys interdimensional beings, because we all are interdimensional, and it doesn't preclude them from being extraterrestrial. And the fact is, if you look at the totality of evidence of this phenomena, in terms of not just sightings and reports of entities, but landing trace cases, where the ground is actually burned or has radiation readings, or where these things are photographed or appear on radar, or people have medical evidence, honest to God, radiation burns that cannot be explained as, exposure to anything else but as heavy duty source of energy. I mean, and for that matter, the crash retrieval reports or the implant removal cases, and there are a lot of them. This is good evidence that we're dealing with extraterrestrials in the classic sense. I think my point is that if you look at the totality of evidence, it's the best theory which fits most of the evidence. And it's extremely logical because here we are on Earth. We know we're biological beings on a planet. I think that's pretty conclusive. It makes perfect sense that there would be others out there, given how many star systems there are, and that people are seeing what look like craft with beings with legs and a head and arms and wearing clothes. So I don't know. It's not conclusive, but I think at this point we know what we're dealing with. We're dealing with beings from other star systems. Where exactly? That's still an open question.
And I know I've asked you this many times, but what are the possible reasons for why they just don't come out and reveal themselves, right? Well, I'll just give you a list maybe, but one could be some sort of, much like Star Trek, like a prime directive that prevents them from doing such a thing. Another could be they have some agreement with the US government. Another could be that we're like ants to them. I don't think it's that, but given the research that you've done, do you have any inkling as to which direction it might be? It could be a fourth option that I didn't even suggest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not pure speculation to say that there is something of a prime directive in terms of non-interference, because this is what contactees have been told, that no, we can't upset your society. It's up to you to evolve to the point where you're accepting of our presence without attacking us. I think it's one of the main reasons is us, our own violent tendencies to destroy or fear anything that is different. So we're quite prejudicial in terms of just someone's appearance. And I think that is probably the main driving force behind why we haven't been, quote, welcomed into the galactic community, so to speak. There is an active cover-up as well that could play a powerful role, because there's not more than just rumors. I mean, there's reports of open official contact in terms of ETs meeting with government officials. I'll point to the Eisenhower meeting at Edwards Air Force Base in 1954, which, if you look into it, has got a surprising amount of corroboration to it. And in short, that's where supposedly or allegedly human-looking ETs contacted Eisenhower and other groups high in the military-industrial complex and pushed for open official contact. And we said, no, we don't want to do that. We want your technology. And they said, no, you need to stop messing around with nuclear power. You're endangering not only yourselves, but other areas you're not even aware of. So that could be one of the reasons we're not having open official contact, is because our governments don't want it or are trying to prevent it. I don't know. I hate to speculate in this field. The fact is, we're not having open official contact. And we've had heavy duty displays, like the 1952, or was it 54, flyover of Washington, D.C. Yeah, 54. And where people are like, why don't they land on the White House lawn? Well, they practically did.
Yeah.
They were caught on radar. They were seen by pilots, air traffic controllers, people on the ground, photographed. This was very widely viewed. This was what UFO researchers call a display. They were showing themselves on purpose. They are, to an extent, already, announcing their presence. But yeah, I think there are several driving forces behind why they're not just landing. But again, that's to an extent speculation. I can't tell you contactees have been told, no, we're not doing this. You guys need to grow up. You need to stop polluting. You need to stop killing each other. You need to start hiring people within government who are truthful and transparent. And
it seems to me it's just getting worse in government. I mean, like and to some extent, it also seems that even the government, particularly elected politicians, have no idea. Like they're just being lied to.
yeah, I'm sure there are people within government who are perfectly aware, and people who are in the loop too.
Well, yeah, people in special access programs, right? I'm sure like that's where a lot of the knowledge resides.
But the vast majority, no. It's changing. I mean, we did have those congressional hearings, and there are people talking. They're aware of the subject now, and anyone, watching that congressional hearing was very disappointing. I mean, I could go on and on about that. But
the thing is, though, like none of the people in Congress are really like, you have to be dogged, and you kind of have to know how some of these programs work, right?
Yeah, but you could pick up just about any UFO book and know that there's something to this phenomenon.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not hard to research this. There's a million people out there who've seen these things, literally. So,
okay,
the evidence is there.
So, going back to the original premise of the episode, because you and I could go on and on about speculation about what's really going on. So you have the Greys, you have human-like. What else have you heard reports about from contactees?
Yeah, this one is really interesting to me. Praying mantis ETs. And I know how that must sound to skeptics. And, I can only apologize and say, sorry, this is what people are reporting. You can't ignore the evidence, and people are reporting seeing figures that are very similar to the praying mantis insects we see on Earth, in that they have, triangular heads with large bulbous eyes, very skinny stick-like limbs. The only real difference is they're reported to be anywhere from, usually 6 to 9 feet tall. Certainly taller than that in some cases. And in some cases shorter.
I'm guessing they don't have like an exoskeleton. It's probably that would, in terms of like an insect, because an insect has an exoskeleton because they're small enough to support it.
Yeah. The people I've talked to could not tell for sure, but they said, no, they don't think so. I mean, I'll just run down some of the reports I have. One guy comes from Kevin Kamen, a Navy medic who was pulled on board a craft, and it was fairly scary for him, as you might imagine, even though it was not in any way a negative experience. It was just very traumatic. And he saw these things, and he says, one walked up right to him, and he said, this thing was more than twice my height. He's slightly over, he's like 6'2". And he said, this thing was 15 feet tall. And I started to second guess him a little bit. I'm like, are you sure? How do you know that? And he's like, listen, it was more than twice my height. It was like looking up at a basketball hoop. This thing was almost 3 times my height. And I'm like, okay, what did you see? And he said they were bone white in appearance, very long stick-like limbs. They moved with jerky movements. They had huge triangular-shaped heads with eyes the size of, bigger than his head. So it was about a basketball size. They oozed intelligence. He ended up having a fairly long telepathic, which is usually the case, conversation with them. And
do they have antennae like insects?
No.
Okay,
no one's reported antenna, not to me. I think probably there are a few accounts out there, but I liked his report because he's a Navy medic. This is someone who's got military training. He's a trained observer, knows his aircraft, and I interviewed him a number of times. I put him on the radio. He went on a couple of TV shows, and never did his story change. He would add a few details here and there, certainly, as people do. Yeah, he was a good witness and described very much what other people have seen, except in his case, these guys were very tall. There was another lady I talked to who headed a UFO group, and I'm like, whoa, why do you head this UFO? I spoke there. This was in Thousand Oaks, California, I think. It's like, oh, I've had contact. I'm like, oh, I would love to interview you. And she described these same praying mantis beings who she walked into her bathroom one evening and there they were. Scared the living daylights out of her. It was not a pleasant experience by any means. And she said they were 6 feet tall and not Gray's praying mantis, almost grasshopper-like. She said, did not get a great description of it because she was so darn scared. One lady, one of my favorite cases ever, was a teacher from O'Fallon, Illinois, who in 2006 was jogging with her dog outside her home. This is a rural area. And she wakes up at 4:30 a.m. to go jogging. And her dog stops on the road. This is, I think, Kyle Road was the road at T intersection in front of her. I actually located the exact spot, on Google Maps and verified all the details she described, which was important to me, a street light, because it's figured in her story. She looks up, and about 100 feet away was a figure walking down the middle of the road. It's a rural road, right? No cars at 4:30 a.m. And her dog's watching it too, so she knows she's not losing her mind. And she thought it was a man on stilts with extenders on his arms at first glance until it walked under the streetlight, and it reached almost to the top of the streetlight. So she has a fairly good way of measuring its height, which she says was close to 15 feet tall. She contacted me after reading Kevin Camen's account. And she's a teacher. She gave a very lucid interview, both written and oral. And she said it was mottled green in appearance, but gave the same description. Very, very slender body, extremely tall, long stick-like legs, which were at least 6 feet strides, little arms that kind of hook up like the praying mantis do, almost like a begging dog, if you will, and did not see her, apparently, and just kept walking down the street. And she ran after it went by. I was kind of surprised to hear her say that. I'm like, really? She says, well, yeah, I was curious, she said. I'm like, okay. And she watched it, and it turned off into a cornfield. And I asked her, why? Why there? Why do you think? She's like, I have no idea. There's nothing there. There's a school, a cornfield. So the only thing I can think of is that we're not too far from Scott Air Force Base, which I thought, because they are implicated in a few UFO reports to a degree. But that's the praying mantis. Got a number of reports like that of these praying mantis type beings.
And is this Orion similar location, or no information?
No information on where these guys come from, but they're sometimes seen in conjunction with grays and human looking in some cases. Yeah, I've got many reports of these guys. This is a common type. It's again about 10%. I'm going to say 60 to 70 grays, 10 to 15 human looking and praying mantis, and another catch-all category. Well, there are some other specific types. Short blue beings. My sister-in-law saw those, and she's an artist. I had her draw them. And I've since shown
Are these
her...
the ones that Whitley Strieber describes as like the mean, like...
Yeah, short little troll-like things. And if you look at his movie Communion, where they did a representation of them, the figures in his movie are strikingly similar to what my sister-in-law drew. I mean, really close. And I showed this picture to other contactees who's like, yeah, I saw short blue beings. I'm like, hold on a second. I have an illustration I'd like to show you. And they're like, oh my God, that's very much what I saw. I showed it to Dolly because she did see them. And she's like, yes, that is absolutely very close to accurate. We didn't get too much into tall grays, but there are short grays, medium-sized grays, and tall grays. So these short blue beings are a very specific type that turns up fairly frequently. And another is tall whites.
Well, going back to the blue ones, the small blue beings. What's to this Strieber characterization that they're unpleasant? I think is the way he described them.
Yeah, well, Strieber, each person reacts to this this experience, often with very strong emotions. And Strieber had a lot of fear surrounding his encounters. He admits this, and I think this is part of the reason he was initially a writer of horror fiction, because he had been dealing with a lot of fear. And certainly if you read his book, it's terrifying. It's one of my favorite books out there, I will say that, on the subject, because he's an excellent writer and describes very vividly, and I think accurately as well. But I think when someone has a very strong fear reaction, your immediate go-to is, this is bad. I don't like this. This is evil. This is bad for me. This is scaring the living daylights out of me. And I've asked contactees over and over again, like, who have had, this is horrible. I think they're demonic. I think they're evil. I'm like, what happened to you? Well, they looked at me. I'm like, okay. Did they actually hurt you? Well, no, but they had an evil, the way they were looking at me, I could just tell. I'm like, but they didn't hurt you. What did they say? Don't be afraid. We won't hurt you. Over and over again, I hear that phrase, literally word for word, with slight variations, like, have no fear. No harm will come to you. So the very, most evil thing, in quotes, I've heard is people being laid out and they're like protesting as they are undressed and examined. But no one describes what I would call sadistic behavior or outright torture, where the ET's going, I'm going to hurt you. No, that's just not what's going on here. And for the first year or two I was involved in this, I was horrified. I'm like, people are being kidnapped against their will. These are bug-like creatures. They have no regard for human compassion. And there is some aspect of them not understanding people's fear. I mean, that happens.
Well, as you noted, like the AI grays don't have emotions, right?
Yeah. And certainly that does turn up, where people are like, these guys had no compassion. Well, yeah, those were the AIs. And Whitley Strieber is like, the Greys asked him, what can we do to stop you from screaming? They weren't evil as we would think of it. When someone's kidnapped on Earth, it rarely ends well. Here, people are being healed. I've got a book on that. One of my books is, 300 cases, people who are healed. And these are supported cases with doctors, diagnosis before and after, x-rays, the whole deal. I mean, some people have sent me their medical records supporting like a cancer cure and things like this. I'm working on another case right now of a guy who was healed of a hernia. He's got his doctor reports. So my point is, people might have a strong fear reaction, and that causes them to label this as bad or evil. No, the little blue guys. I asked Dolly about this. It's funny, because my sister-in-law, Christy, says, oh no, I thought of them as my friends. I enjoyed it when they came. And they were recording her memories. They were interested in her perceptions up to that time. And Dolly says that they often contact children and they try to help them with their fear. And they're very friendly. She said she thought they were really cute, actually. And I've had a number of people describe the Greys but being very lovely, very cute. I interviewed a guy just recently at an encounter in Canada. It was some years ago. He had it as a teenager, but he saw a Grey outside while hiking at night, and he stopped and his eyes went wide and he put his head forward and he stared at it. And the Grey did the same darn thing in an exaggerated way, kind of like he and it went at him. And then he shook his head and the Grey did the same thing, kind of mimicking him in a playful way. He said it really reduced his fear. And it was just being funny and playful. So I've come more and more to that sort of side that, no, they're not here to hurt us. It can be very scary for people, but often your fear will color your perception. And
now you were starting to talk about the tall whites.
Yeah, tall whites, I think, came into fame with the reports from Charles Hall and his books, Millennial Hospitality series. Charles Hall's an Army weather observer who was in Indian Springs, Nellis area of Nevada, and reported seeing essentially human, but not quite, tall, very much human looking, but very pale skin, very large eyes, very slender. When I say tall, yeah, 6, 7, 8 feet tall. And these are some with hair, often described as very white or blonde. And eyes are usually bright in terms of, bluish or green or along those lines. But very nearly human features, but clearly not human because they're very odd looking. But these are called tall whites. And I don't have a whole lot of reports of them, but I have some. Dolly, I keep coming back to her because she's had a lot of extensive contact and has been introduced to a number of these guys. And that may sound unusual for one person to see, so many species, so to speak, but it's really not. Jay Gardner, he's another contact. He's like, yeah, I've seen a bunch of them. Another lady up in Maine, she doesn't want her name used. I call her Lynette. She's seen human looking. She's seen grays. She saw short little, she called them grasshopper type. Yeah, it's not unusual for people to see multiple types of ETs, particularly if they are repeated contactee who's being continually taken on board. And the reason this is, just real quick, is because it appears that these guys are all in concert with each other, in cooperation. They are working together. They're all very telepathic. That's the universal language. It's almost without exception how communication is done with ETs. So it could be that they are much more closely related to each other and us, for that matter, than we realize. That they all carry the same sort of genomes, the genetic material. Dolly says that is absolutely true. She says, they are us, we are them. And when she said that, I'm like, oh gosh, here we go again. Because that's a very, very common message among contactees. Another guy, Don Anderson, he saw grays. He saw praying mantis ETs. He saw human-looking ETs. He's a really nice gentleman who has gone on the lecture circuit, has written a little bit about his experiences, but did allow me to interview him, and gave a great interview and described the same thing. He had a very extensive encounter with praying mantis type ETs and had grays and human-looking ones as well. So yeah, there's grays, there's tall whites, there's little blue beings, there's praying mantis. Then we get to their catch-all category. And this just, I don't even know where to go with this, because people will describe to me absolutely unique humanoids. And I'll give you one example, a guy from Canada who had an encounter with his friends, by the way. They only remember seeing these figures from a distance and had missing time, but he walked right up to them. He said they were 10 feet tall. I said, 10 feet, really? He's like, well, maybe 9, but I had to look up to them. I'm over 6 feet tall.
This is the one where they had like the really kind of creepy looking faces, like old. I mean, not creepy, but old.
Yes, exactly. He had the impression they were very old, thick skin, very wrinkly skin, huge, enormous eyes, dirty teeth, large noses. They were wearing shiny black jumpsuit types of things with a high collar and gold-lined irises, blue and gold-lined irises. Very peculiar looking, slicked back, dark hair, very odd looking. And he insists up and down they were 9, 10 feet tall. And I've never heard anyone describe anything like this. But you hear this, it's in the literature, just what I would call humanoids of varying description. And I'm wondering what's going on here. Is it, like Dolly says, there's just the human genome throughout the universe, and it's all dials up differently. And there's evolutionary variations. One lady, she's had lifelong contact with grays and had an experience where she found herself in this, what she perceived to be an underground chamber. This is a housewife from Nebraska, no reason for contact that she can think of other than it's, in her family. But she described this 9 foot tall humanoid. And the reason she contacted me was because she wanted to hear someone else describe what she saw. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I've never heard a description like what you're telling me. And she said this guy was wearing, again, a dark suit with a cape. Capes turn up in some of these humanoid cases. And we saw this guy walking down a corridor towards her. She was laid out on a table, and he entered her cubicle, so to speak. He said, "All right, Jill, it's your turn." And that caused a huge fear reaction. She's like, "My turn? What? What are you talking about?" But she said this guy was 9 feet tall, broad-shouldered, a human-ish face in terms of eyes, nose, and mouth, but an extremely large jutting chin that was inhumanly large, an oversized forehead, enormous eyes. And she says it wasn't even hair on his head. It looked like straw, and it stuck up 3 inches straight up. And when that turned up in the Carl Higdon case, he described a normal-sized humanoid, but it had orange hair sticking straight up. So this is what I would call the catch-all category. And I could go on and on with different types of humanoids, but they always have 2 eyes, almost always a nose and mouth and ears and 2 arms. We're not getting people with 6 arms or anything, or tentacles or this sort of thing, which is kind of what I expected as a skeptic, as a science fiction fan.
Well, there's one that you didn't mention that, in the cultural zeitgeist is pretty commonly referred to, and that's the reptilian sort of, body type, species, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Have you ever had any accounts of those?
I have. Not a lot. And that's close in my files. I'll preface that as 2% maybe. And then what do I have? Like 5 cases maybe. And some of these are people who did not consent to a formal interview. There was a lady who did the lecture circuit, Pamela Stonebrook, I believe was her name. And she described a reptilian who would come into her house at night. And he was friendly, which was unusual because that's not what I usually hear. So Barbara Lamb, another prominent researcher, claims to have had contact with not only Greys, but a reptilian. And these are described as generally 6 to 8 feet tall, very large, a lizard-like face in terms of being scaly, and something of a snout, though usually shortened, large, sharp, carnivorous type teeth, sometimes a tail, sometimes not, broad chest, very reptilian in appearance in terms of eyes with slitted pupils. There was one guy I talked to who was an Army officer, and he had a confrontation with what he believed reptilian humanoids. And he said it was about 7 feet tall and twice as wide as a normal person, scared the living daylights out of him. And he was with a group of other soldiers who were confronted with this being, was apparently, this is a strange story, cooperating within military circles. And they marched one of these guys up to him, and all the other soldiers broke rank, and he didn't. And this thing walked right up to him, and I asked him to describe it to me. And he actually began weeping as I was interviewing him. And I'm like, I'm really sorry, it's okay, you don't have to. He's like, no, I want to, but I can't give you a good description because it scared me that badly and I didn't want to look. But he said it had reptilian eyes, it had reptilian skin with little scales on it. So I would call that a reptilian humanoid as opposed to your straight up reptilian. One lady who saw reptilian, she reported in the forest. I've got a couple of reports that no UFO was involved whatsoever. So
what's the difference between a reptilian humanoid and a reptilian?
A reptilian has claws and, a full-on reptilian face. Whereas the guy that I interviewed, who I call Ramon, he would allow his name to be used, but I elected not to because he's got a large extended family. And I just didn't think it was right to expose his identity and subject his whole family to all of this. And he described them as being very much human features, except for the eyes and the skin and the general size. So there's some hybridization aspect to some of these beings. We see that with grays, half human, half gray. And for that matter, a number of the others as well. But yeah, reptilian is definitely one of the types who I might not call extraterrestrial necessarily, but crypto-terrestrial, in that according to the buzz or the rumors, no one's been able to determine what star system they're necessarily from. But according to some contactees, they're from here. I interviewed a lady in Florida. She does not allow her name to be used, and she's absolutely convinced that they are survivors from the reptilian age of dinosaurs. Dolly says the same thing too. That's what her belief is, that they could be what we would call, I don't think she likes that term so much, crypto-terrestrials, but not extraterrestrials as we would think of them, coming from another star system. But yeah, there's a researcher, his last name is Rhodes. I forget his first name. He's really specialized in those reports. William Rhodes, Bill Rhodes, I forget his first name, honestly, but he's collected a bunch of these reports.
And let's save all this stuff for the next episode about other phenomena, because you could probably potentially throw Bigfoot into that category, maybe, like Sasquatch, those sightings.
Or little robotic being, or tall robotic beings. Robotic beings. There are light beings again, and short little hairy humanoids, which do come out of UFOs. There's a lot of reports from South America for whatever reason of that. Whereas Europe and Russia and gets much more prominently human-looking reports. But it's worldwide. Grays, they're all humanoid, which I find very, very interesting.
Is it all carbon-based life forms, or are there potentially like silicoid or silicon-based?
No evidence of that. Yeah, by all accounts, they're probably very, very much like us. There was a guy in Australia who apparently got a hair from what we would call a Nordic, and that was tested and turned out to have some very unusual properties, in that there was absolutely zero color to the hair, was almost translucent, and it ended up being somewhat genetically similar to, gosh, I'd have to look it up. There's a book called The Hair of the Alien by Bill Chalker. It's about Peter Corey, I think is his name. At any rate, he described having this hair sample, which I believe was Scandinavian, mostly in origin, which was quite unusual. There's some genetic evidence, but it's so darn limited that it's inconclusive and statistically insignificant in terms of being able to truly study this stuff. But yeah, I suspect that they are genetic, carbon-based beings, all of them.
Any other beings that common? Is that?
Oh yeah,
have you covered most of it?
I talked to a lady from the Midwest. Her name is Sue. She described a cat-like being, and I put her account on the back burner because I'm like, no. She's like, this was a 4-foot tall cat-like being with fur and kind of claw-like hands. I'm like, this is really unusual. And I eventually got more reports, and it's in the literature. There's some speculation these are Lyrans from the Lyra constellation. And I asked Dolly about this, and she's like, well, yeah, I did actually see those once. She got to walk up right next to them. I'm like, you're kidding. She's like, no. She described them in detail. And there's another type of being which is much like a Anubis, I guess, from Egyptian mythology.
Like dog-like, basically.
Yes. And there are numerous reports of dogmen here on Earth. I talked to Linda Godfrey, the main cryptozoological researcher who's looked into them. this is the sort of thing people have reported. Dog-like beings. I mean, it goes on from there. It really does. There's the Anunnaki, winged beings. And Dolly reports seeing those at one point. She was taken specifically to meet them, which was a really extraordinary story. I have not talked to anyone else who's described that personally. There are reports out there of, bird-like beings, for sure, which I again put on the back burner until I started getting more reports. And because this is just a lot to swallow for a lot of people, and me coming as a complete skeptic was caused, I had a lot of trouble with it. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, this was very hard for me to accept initially, but after you really dig in and do your research, that there's validity to these reports. And I am not willing to throw away evidence simply because it's anecdotal and is unsupported by, hard physical evidence. Because there is hard physical evidence to support the existence of UFOs, which, we already briefly mentioned in terms of, landing traces and so forth, medical evidence. So it just is an endless variety of humanoids, which is kind of what I think we would expect if, given that we are humanoids with wide variation here on this planet, and we know we can't be alone just through sheer logic. So we would expect there to be variations. And the humanoid form appears to be the template. This is why actually, in my latest book, Symmetry, that I was going to call it Dolly Among the Stars, because, her story is so amazing, where she's out there, seeing all this stuff. She wanted to call it Symmetry because this is what she was taught. There's a symmetry to life throughout the universe, and that all these people are basically humanoid in origin, and that we did not evolve on this planet, which, I kind of wondered about myself. There's a book by Ellis Silver called Humans Are Not From Earth. And he puts forth an argument that we're not really well adapted to this planet in terms of temperature and diet and so forth. And he makes some good points. It's certainly largely speculative, but I thought it was really interesting because given that there are human-looking beings being reported coming from these ships that are coming down and visiting our planet, that raises questions about, our relationship to them and, for that matter, our own origins.
All right, Preston, with that, thank you again for coming on the show. And this was, as always, a fascinating discussion. So see you in the next episode.
My pleasure. Thanks, Sean.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.